25,000 feet over southern Germany. The air is crystal clear, a sky so still it almost looks peaceful. Below, rivers twist through green valleys. Small towns smoke gently from chimneys. But above them, the sky is alive, shaking, roaring, burning. 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses crawl across the stratosphere in tight formation, engines droning in perfect rhythm. Each one weighs 30 tons. Each one carries 10 men, 4,000 pounds of bombs, and 13 50 caliber Browning machine guns. It's 1,400 hours. Target, Schweinfurt. The city that makes the ball bearings that keep the German war machine turning. Inside our baby, a B-17G of the 305th Bomb Group, Waist Gunner Sergeant Frank Murphy wipes frost from his oxygen mask. The air temperature outside is 40 degrees Fahrenheit. He can barely move his fingers. Every breath tastes like metal. Then, the call that freezes every heart in the formation. Fighters, 11 o'clock high! The formation braces. From above the horizon, like a black storm breaking, 300 German fighters dive through the sunlight. BF-109s, FW-190s. Some carry 30mm cannons, others unguided rockets. The first line opens fire from 800 yards, shells ripping through the upper bombers. A fortress erupts into flame, spinning away in seconds. But the rest don't break formation, they tighten it. Each bomber locks into its assigned position, like interlocking shields. Waist gunners swing their twin 50s toward the diving fighters, tracers streaking upward in blinding arcs. The sky turns into geometry. Intersecting lines of fire, red-orange flashes against the silver cold. A German pilot, Lieutenant Erich Henne, lines up his target, dives head-on toward a fortress. He squeezes the trigger. Cannon shells hammer the nose of the lead plane. But the B-17 doesn't flinch. The chin turret tracks him perfectly. 2 streams of 50 caliber fire meet his Messerschmitt at 400 yards. The cockpit vanishes in flame. Henne's 109 disintegrates. His wingmate pulls away. Too late. The next B-17 catches him broadside. He's gone, too. From the outside, it looks like madness. Bombers refusing to maneuver, flying straight into gunfire. But inside the formation, it's order. Every gunner has a sector. Every burst overlaps with another. The fortresses aren't individuals. They're a single machine. A fortress made of aluminum, men, and fire. Navigator Lieutenant Jack Greiner checks his map through shaking hands. The flak zone begins in 5 minutes. They've already been under attack for 30 by... Stay in formation, the pilot mutters through frozen lips. We're still a mile high on the numbers. Below, the wrecks of B-17s fall burning through cloud layers, black spirals against white mist. Some crews bail out, tiny dots with parachutes opening like seeds. But even as planes die, the formation doesn't break. Every German pilot knows the math by now. To stop a single B-17 formation, you have to kill half of it. But to get that close, you fly into a storm of 1,000 guns. Luftwaffe Commander Oberst Walter Grabmann, leading JG-300, shouts over the radio, "Attack in pairs! Hit the lead ships! Ignore the rest!" It's suicide math. FW-190s dive from above, cannon shells slashing through the first box. But the overlapping fire zones catch them mid-turn. One by one, the attackers vanish in smoke. The air smells of burned oil, tracer phosphorus, and frozen blood. By 14:30, the formation reaches the target. Schweinfurt's industrial district glitters below, endless rows of ball-bearing plants. The bomb bay doors open. The bomb run lasts 62 seconds. Flak bursts everywhere. One direct hit tears through a bomber's wing, another rips open a tail section. But the crews don't break concentration. The Norden bomb sight locks on. The release switches click in sequence. 1, 2, 3. Hundreds of bombs fall through the smoke. The lead bombardier says quietly into his mask, "Bombs away." From the ground, the citizens of Schweinfurt look up. The sky is fire. One witness writes later, "It was as if the heavens themselves were made of burning metal." The formation turns west. They've dropped their payload. Now comes the harder part, getting home. Behind them, the Luftwaffe is regrouping. Dozens of German fighters climb again, hungry for vengeance. As the bombers turn into the sun, one German ace radios to his wingman. They don't even break. It's like shooting at a wall that shoots back. And that was the moment the laughter stopped. The Flying Fortress wasn't supposed to survive daylight over Germany. It wasn't supposed to fight off waves of interceptors alone. It wasn't supposed to work. But it did. It turned the sky into a killing field, and the hunters into prey. By nightfall, 60 B-17s would be lost, but 100 German fighters would never fly again. And both sides would understand that the era of air superiority was ending, replaced by a new law of war. Not speed, not grace, firepower. The fortress had spoken. Before the B-17 became legend, it was a punchline. When it first appeared in 1938, the Germans laughed at it. A four-engine bomber, slow and heavy, flying in daylight without fighter escort. To the Luftwaffe, it looked like suicide with propellers. In 1940, when war consumed Europe, German doctrine was built around Geschwindigkeit, speed. The Bf-109 and Fw-190 symbolized that belief. Climb fast, strike first, disappear. A bomber that lumbered through the sky was nothing but a moving target. Even in Britain, many doubted the American idea of precision daylight bombing. The RAF had already tried it in 1940 and paid in blood. Their solution was to hide in darkness, to burn cities by night. The Americans refused. They believed a formation of fortresses flying tight could protect itself, each bomber a gun and a massive floating wall. The Germans called it arrogance. In 1942, the first B-17Es of the 8th Air Force arrived in England. Ground crews in muddy fields looked at the big gray machines and shook their heads. They leaked oil, burned fuel, and filled the runway with thunder. Luftwaffe intelligence reports mocked them as langsam, blind und tot bei Tag, slow, blind, and dead by day. Early missions seemed to prove it. The first American raids over Rouen and Lille lost bombers to flak and fighters. German pilots bragged that a single pass from a 20mm cannon could rip a fortress apart. They even competed for who could bring one down first. A kill on a B-17 earned bragging rights and sometimes champagne. And yet behind the laughter was something the Germans didn't understand. Formation discipline. The B-17's strength wasn't in one plane. It was in geometry. A single fortress had blind spots. A group of 12 had none. Their defensive arcs overlapped into a rotating sphere of fire. To a Luftwaffe pilot diving in from 12 o'clock, that meant flying through the muzzle flashes of at least 24 Browning M2s before even reaching firing range. But the Germans didn't believe the Americans would hold formation under fire. They were sure fear would scatter them. That was the bet. And the Americans, young, untested, many barely 20 years old, decided to prove them wrong. Inside each fortress, 10 men lived inside a machine barely the size of a city bus. Pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, top turret, ball turret, 2 waist gunners, tail gunner. Each one knew his sector, his arcs, his job. They trained to move, to reload, to cover each other without words. By the time the Luftwaffe realized what was happening, the formations had evolved into something new, a moving fortress system. It wasn't speed that made the B-17 deadly. It was rhythm. German pilots who expected easy kills found themselves trapped in crossfire. Their attack runs, head-on from 6 o'clock or from the sun, became mathematical death traps. One burst of 50 caliber fire could shear off a wing or ignite a fuel tank. Still, the jokes continued. German radio propaganda called the bombers aluminum rain. Crews of JG-26 and JG-2 celebrated after each mission, until they looked around and realized their veteran pilots weren't coming back. Each easy target took down one, sometimes two fighters with it. And even when they burned, the fortresses didn't fall fast. Crews counted B-17s limping home with engines gone, tails shredded, half the fuselage missing, but still flying. The German high command began to notice something terrifying in the reports. For every bomber destroyed, 3 more took its place the next week. Production at Boeing, Douglas, and Vega was accelerating. The Americans weren't just sending planes. They were sending a process, an industrial rhythm that no pilot could shoot down. By late 1942, Luftwaffe ace Egon Mayer, who specialized in head-on attacks, warned his men, "Don't underestimate them. Each of those fortresses is a fortress indeed." But pride dies slowly. In barrooms from Lille to Bremen, Luftwaffe pilots still laughed at the clumsy American bombers, still told stories about how they fell like stones. They still believed their skill could conquer American steel. That belief would cost them everything. Because in the next year the joke would reverse, and the fortresses would turn that laughter into smoke. In 1943, the hunters would meet their first wall of fire, and they would discover that the sky they ruled was no longer theirs to fly in. War in the air was never really about wings or pilots. It was about factories. And by 1943, no two nations embodied that truth more violently than Germany and the United States. Seattle, Washington. Boeing Plant 2. A city within a city. 12,000 workers, 7 assembly lines, hundreds of cranes. From the street, it looked like a warehouse. From the sky, it was invisible, literally. The roof was camouflaged to look like suburban houses, complete with fake streets, lawns, and laundry lines. Inside, beneath the illusion, was the beating heart of the flying fortress. Each week, hundreds of B-17s took shape here. Tail to nose, nose to wing, steel turned to flight in less than 20 days. Engines from Pratt & Whitney, radios from RCA, oxygen systems from Minnesota, ball turrets from Sperry. The fortress was more than a plane. It was an American continent turned into aluminum. Every time a worker tightened a bolt, a bomber somewhere in Europe became harder to kill. Augsburg, Germany. Messerschmitt Works. 1943. What had once been a masterpiece of engineering was now a patchwork. Allied bombers had already hit Augsburg and Bremen. Machine tools were moved underground. Skilled labor was vanishing into the Wehrmacht. Fuel rations cut test flights in half. German aircraft designers like Willy Messerschmitt and Kurt Tank were working miracles with fewer materials and more fear. The Luftwaffe still turned out Bf-109s and FW-190s by the hundreds, but the supply chain was crumbling. The contrast wasn't just industrial, it was philosophical. The Luftwaffe believed in the ace, the gifted individual pilot whose talent could decide a battle. America believed in the system, the process that could replace the man and repeat the result forever. In 1943, both philosophies met over Europe. At first, the Germans dominated. They had experience, tactics, and training. Their aircraft were optimized for quick sorties and close airfields. But they were fighting the wrong kind of enemy. Each B-17 wasn't just a plane. It was an equation. It carried its own gunners, its own defense, and the weight of an economy that never slept. Back in Seattle, the factory's rhythm was mechanical poetry. A new fortress every 63 minutes. A shipment of 50 caliber guns every 40. Every morning, a new set of crews graduating from gunnery schools in Arizona and Florida, trained on mock turrets, simulators, and math. By the time a B-17 reached the skies over Europe, it wasn't just flying with the 10 men inside. It was flying with an entire nation behind it. Germany had brilliance. America had abundance. And in total war, abundance wins. Luftwaffe planners knew the arithmetic was turning against them. Their production graphs looked clean until you overlaid them with fuel charts, manpower, and training curves. Then the lines started to fall apart. By mid-1943, the Reichsluftfahrtministerium reported that fuel production was down 25%, while pilot losses had tripled. Each replacement squadron was younger, less trained, more desperate. Meanwhile, American production was so vast that logistics became absurd. In one instance, the 8th Air Force had to destroy newly arrived B-17s in Britain simply to make room for more. It was industrial Darwinism at global scale. Germany could design an FW-190 in half the time. America could build 10 fortresses in that same span. And what those factories were really producing wasn't just bombers, it was attrition. Every B-17 shot down meant 10 men gone, yes. But every Bf-109 shot down meant one irreplaceable veteran. By the second half of 1943, German fighter groups like JG-26 were already losing more experienced pilots than they could train. Boeing could replace aluminum. The Luftwaffe couldn't replace experience. Even when the Luftwaffe captured or studied downed fortresses, they dismissed the design as too heavy, too slow. They missed the point. The B-17 didn't need to be perfect, it needed to be enough. Enough to keep flying, enough to keep bombing, enough to make the math impossible for Germany to solve. One German engineer reportedly said after the war, "It was not the Flying Fortress that defeated us. It was the factory that made it endless." The skies over Europe weren't just battlefields. They were moving assembly lines. Every sortie was a test of who could keep feeding the machine longer. By mid-1943, that answer was clear. Germany had to win with precision. America only had to keep showing up. The Luftwaffe laughed at that logic until they realized it couldn't be shot down, and the fortress kept coming. Every war machine hides its logic in numbers, and the B-17's logic was brutal, simple, and absolute. Each B-17 Flying Fortress carried 13 Browning M2 50-caliber machine guns, over 12,000 rounds of ammunition, a bomb load averaging 4,000 pounds, and 10 men, each with a defined field of fire that linked into the next. When a formation of 20 fortresses flew together, it was not 20 planes. It was a 360-degree storm of lead capable of firing over 200,000 bullets in 5 minutes. No fighter formation in history had ever faced that. The B-17's designers at Boeing called it defensive overlap. Gunners called it the box. Each bomber flew close, wings nearly touching, so that its fire zones intersected perfectly with its neighbors. Front, rear, belly, flanks. No approach angle was safe. A Luftwaffe pilot diving in from 12 o'clock had to pass through 3 layers of converging fire before reaching range. At 6 o'clock, 4. In training films, Boeing engineers demonstrated that a fighter could expect to survive 2.8 seconds once inside the firing arc. The numbers were terrifying, even to the men inside. Each 50-caliber gun fired at 850 rounds per minute. Multiply that by 13 per plane. Multiply that by 50 bombers. Then remember that each round could punch through half an inch of armor at 200 yards. That's not combat. That's arithmetic with consequences. And the Germans learned it the hard way. During the summer of 1943, Luftwaffe ace Egon Meyer, credited with developing the head-on attack strategy, calculated that it took 15 to 20 hits from a 20mm cannon to bring down a B-17, but only 3 hits from a 50 to destroy a fighter. The equation was already tilted. The B-17 wasn't the fastest or most agile aircraft, but it didn't have to be. It turned the air itself into geometry, overlapping spheres of death where any intruder faced a mathematically predictable end. For every German pass that scored a hit, 10 others ended in smoke. By mid-1943, Luftwaffe squadrons were reporting unacceptable loss ratios. In 1 month of fighting the fortresses over Bremen and Kiel, JG-2 and JG-26 lost 40% of their pilots. The Germans could not replace that kind of arithmetic. A bomber formation didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to survive. And the fortress was built to survive. Every major system had redundancy. Dual hydraulic lines, dual electrical buses, self-sealing fuel tanks. A plane could lose an engine, a rudder, even half a wing, and still limp home. Crews told stories of fortresses flying hundreds of miles on fire, or returning with one landing gear, or surviving 200 flak holes. In one famous case, a B-17 named All-American returned to base after a mid-air collision. Its tail nearly severed. The structure held. The Luftwaffe didn't believe machines could take that much punishment. The B-17 proved that they could. Every fortress lost cost. America 10 men. But every raid cost Germany irreplaceable pilots, gallons of precious fuel, and the morale of the men who realized the bombers kept coming back. Then came the reinforcement. Escort fighters. By late 1943, the B-17's biggest weakness, range, began to close. The P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang were arriving. By early 1944, their protective umbrella reached Berlin. That was the end game. Now, the fortress didn't just defend itself, it brought the sky with it. When German intelligence officers plotted the cost curves, the graphs told a quiet horror story. Average German fighter sortie, 90 minutes. Average survival rate per month, 60%. Training pipeline per new pilot, 18 months. Against that, the B-17 force grew by hundreds per month, each one part of a system that was self-replicating. In other words, the Luftwaffe was running out of math. The fortress had turned the air war into a factory equation. If A, production, B, attrition, then C, victory, becomes inevitable. The Luftwaffe still thought in duels. The United States thought in decimals. One German ace, Heinz Nocke, described the experience of diving into a fortress formation like flying through a volcano. He wrote, "We came from above. The air was full of fire. My wingman vanished in an orange flash. I flew through smoke so thick I thought I was already dead." To shoot down one bomber, you had to fly into hell. To destroy the Luftwaffe, you only had to keep flying the same pattern. By late 1943, German fighter losses over Germany had increased 400% in 6 months. The fortress didn't win with speed. It won with scale, a city in the sky that could not be killed faster than it could rebuild. Every B-17 that reached target meant another German city, another factory, another airfield burning. Every fortress lost meant nothing if the system behind it didn't stop. And it didn't. That's what broke the Luftwaffe. Not the gunner's skill, not the bomb's accuracy, but the math of persistence. The flying fortress was more than a weapon. It was a message. And the message was simple. You can shoot us down, but you can't stop us from coming. Dawn over England. August 17, 1943. Fog on the runways of Thorpe Abbotts and Kimbolton. Ground crews in greasy overalls move between rows of B-17s painted in olive drab, each one bearing a name hand-painted on its nose: Memphis Belle, Hell's Angels, Chowhound, Sky Queen. In briefing huts, crews sip black coffee and stare at the mission map. 2 targets, deep inside Germany. 1. Regensburg, where Messerschmitt builds the Bf-109s. 2. Schweinfurt, where the Reich makes the ball bearings every tank, plane, and truck depends on. It's the first deep penetration raid without fighter escort. The air war is about to meet its trial by fire. Major General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, told his men the night before, "We are not just bombing factories, we are bombing the future of German war." The crews didn't know that half of them wouldn't come back. At 0630 hours, the first wave of B-17s lifts off. 146 fortresses head for Regensburg. Another 230 follow toward Schweinfurt. The plan is brilliant on paper, a 2-pronged strike to split the Luftwaffe's defenses. In reality, timing and weather betray them. The Regensburg group departs on schedule. The Schweinfurt group is delayed by fog. The Germans, alerted by radar, have time to recover and rearm between attacks. By the time the first formation crosses the Rhine, hundreds of German fighters are climbing to meet them. At 25,000 feet, the contrails converge. Bf-109s, from JG-3 Udet and FW-190s from JG-26 Schlageter dive in from the sun using the new Sturmstaffel tactic. Head-on, 12 o'clock high, all guns firing. The first 5 minutes are chaos. Lieutenant John Morgan, co-pilot of Ruthie 2, watches the lead ship explode in midair, scattering aluminum confetti through the sky. His own pilot slumps in his seat, skull split by a 20mm round. Morgan takes the controls. Blood freezes to his gloves. He keeps the bomber steady through an hour of attacks, refusing to break formation. He will earn the Medal of Honor. Below them, the sky becomes a web of tracer lines, each streak a calculation of life and death. In Miss Wachita, Waist Gunner Sergeant Ralph Parker fires 500 rounds in the first 10 minutes. His gun barrels glow orange. "It was like holding lightning," he wrote later. At 27,000 feet, oxygen masks freeze solid. Shells punch holes through wings big enough to crawl through. Bomb bay doors jam open. Crews fight fires with bare hands. By 900, the fortresses reach Regensburg. The Messerschmitt factory sprawls below, the cradle of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. Bomb bay doors open. The Norden bomb sight locks on. For 60 seconds, the sky is a factory of falling steel. 1,000 bombs drop. Direct hits tear through assembly lines, hangars, test stands. Then, instead of turning home, the Regensburg group turns south, across the Alps to North Africa. Out of fuel, out of oxygen, but out of range. Half their planes make it. The rest fall into the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, the Schweinfurt group presses on, 230 bombers flying alone into a sky already burning. They reach the target by early afternoon. The ball-bearing plants are visible through the haze. "Bombs away," calls Major Robert Williams of the 306th Bomb Group. Seconds later, flak erupts so thick it looks like black rain. The formation shatters. Bombers spiral down one by one. Crews bail out into enemy fields. But the bombs land true. The Schweinfurt factories are hit hard, 34% of capacity destroyed. On the return, the Luftwaffe strikes again. Dozens of fortresses never make it across the channel. By sunset, the cost is staggering. 60 B-17s lost, 600 airmen killed or captured, 20% of the entire attacking force gone in one day. The Luftwaffe celebrates that night. German radio calls it the Day of the American Massacre. But inside the fighter wings, there's no laughter. JG-26 and JG-2 report catastrophic pilot losses. Over 100 fighters destroyed, many of them aces. Fuel stocks drained, maintenance backlogs doubled. For the first time, the Luftwaffe realizes the math doesn't add up. They can't afford another victory like this. In London, Allied analysts run the numbers. The mission is labeled Black Tuesday, but even as the survivors land, their message is clear. The fortresses reached the target, they hit it, and they hurt Germany. Commanders debate whether the cost was worth it. The answer comes from the men who flew it. Waist Gunner Sergeant Andy Rooney, later a war correspondent, wrote, "We saw the factories burning. That was the first time I thought, maybe this war can be won." The Regensburg-Schweinfurt raid didn't win the war, but it changed its shape. The Luftwaffe proved it could still destroy bombers. The Americans proved they would keep coming anyway. And from that day, both sides knew. The real question wasn't who could shoot more. It was who could last longer. For the Germans, the answer would soon become unbearable. By the end of 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force was running on stubbornness. Every deep raid over Germany seemed like suicide with math attached. On missions like Regensburg, Bremen, and Munster, 1 in 4 B-17s failed to return. Entire squadrons vanished from radar. The fortresses had proven their endurance, but the cost was unbearable. The Luftwaffe called it the Year of the Turret. From January to October 1943, German fighter wings claimed more than 1,600 bombers destroyed, and for every American gunner who made it home, 10 more never did. But something was shifting beneath the smoke, something invisible yet unstoppable. the Americans were learning. In the fall of 1943, intelligence officers at High Wycombe began plotting survival rates against formation geometry. The data was clear. Bombers flying in loose groups suffered 40% losses. Tight combat boxes, 3 groups interlocked, cut that by half. Adding the new chin turret to the B-17G reduced head-on losses by 28%. It wasn't luck. It was engineering applied to courage. Crew manuals were rewritten. Gunners were trained to fire shorter bursts, synchronize with each other, and hold fire until the exact range. No more chaos, no wasted rounds. Every fortress became a measured weapon, every crew a system of efficiency. At the same time, something massive was happening back home. The long-range fighter solution was coming online. The Thunderbolt had already proven its might at medium altitude, but it still lacked the legs to reach deep into Germany. The Mustang changed that. With drop tanks and the Merlin engine, the P-51 could escort fortresses all the way to Berlin. In December 1943, the first Mustangs joined the bomber streams. In January 1944, they rewrote the rules of air warfare. The Luftwaffe's fatal equation began to collapse. Before the escorts, bomber loss rates averaged 25% per major mission. Within 90 days of the Mustang's arrival, that number dropped to less than 5%. But the collapse went deeper than percentages. It tore through Germany's very ability to resist. The new American strategy, Operation Argument, better known as Big Week, February 20 to 25, 1944, was the mathematical revenge for Schweinfurt. In 1 week, 3,800 bombers and 2,600 fighters hit every major aircraft plant in the Reich: Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Augsburg, Gotha, Leipzig. Factories were flattened. But more importantly, the Luftwaffe came up to fight and bled itself out. In 6 days, the Luftwaffe lost 600 fighters and over 100 veteran pilots. The 8th Air Force lost 240 bombers. But for the first time, the Americans could replace them faster than they could die. For every fortress destroyed, 2 more arrived from the factories. For every German ace killed, there was no one left to take his place. The math of destruction had inverted. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe's kill ratio in the West, once 3-to-1 in their favor, fell below parity. By June, it was 5-to-1 against them. And the Americans had learned how to break the rhythm of German defense. Fighter sweeps, Mustangs hunting ahead of the bomber streams, tore through staging fields before the Germans could even scramble. Bomber formations climbed higher, flew in denser grids, and used radar-controlled spacing that made interception nearly impossible. Luftwaffe commanders called it der eiserne Teppich, the iron carpet, a wall of metal stretching horizon to horizon. Each fortress formation now represented an entire production ecosystem. Each 50-caliber tracer was a line on an American factory chart. Germany tried to adapt with heavier cannons and rocket attacks. New Sturmgruppen FW-190s carried 30mm shells capable of blowing a B-17 apart in one hit. But these planes were slower, armored, and easily intercepted. By mid-1944, every Sturmgruppe mission was suicide. The American pilots noticed the change. The once feared Focke-Wulfs now flew with hesitation, diving only once before fleeing. When intercepted by P-51s, they rarely fought back. The Luftwaffe had become a shadow, still dangerous, but trapped in the wrong kind of war. Inside the 8th Air Force, the difference was visible in numbers and faces. Crews that once bet cigarettes on survival now bet on who'd make 25 missions, the magic number for rotation home. It wasn't a fantasy anymore. Men were making it. By June 1944, for the first time, the 8th Air Force had more returning crews than replacements. The Fortress had evolved from a blunt weapon into a sustained system, a flying symbol of endurance engineered by feedback, data, and loss. Hub Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, wrote it plainly. The Luftwaffe is not being defeated in combat. It is being ground out of existence. And that's exactly what happened. When the Allies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the skies were clear. Out of 800 Luftwaffe fighters in northern France, fewer than 150 could even take off. The once proud Jagdwaffe, the hunter arm, was now prey. From the gunner's window of a B-17, you could see it happening in real time. The attacks were fewer, the dives clumsier, the enemy more distant. The fortress didn't just survive. It evolved into inevitability. The Germans had laughed at the idea of a flying fortress. Now they feared it the way infantry feared artillery, as something impersonal, unstoppable, and endless. The 8th Air Force had learned to survive. The Luftwaffe had learned it couldn't. And from that point forward, the outcome of the air war was no longer in question. Only the timetable for Germany's surrender. Imagine being inside a B-17 at 25,000 feet. You're not flying, you're enduring. The air is thin, colder than any winter on Earth. Your oxygen mask burns against your face, your breath freezes inside the tube. The noise is a constant metal roar, like living inside an earthquake. The walls vibrate with each engine stroke, and every second could be your last. This is the gunner's war. 10 men, 1 machine, and nothing between them and the enemy but thin aluminum and courage. Each position is its own small world of terror. The ball turret gunner, a man barely 5.5 feet tall, is crammed into a spinning glass sphere under the belly of the plane. It's the loneliest spot in the war. No parachute, no space to move, and the best view of hell. Every time the fortress banks, his stomach rises into his throat. He watches tracers arc upward from the ground, and knows that if one hits the turret ring, he'll never come out alive. The waist gunners stand by open windows, 1 on each side. They wear flak vests, heavy gloves, and electrically heated suits that sometimes short out mid-flight. The guns are mounted on swivels, M2 Brownings of 50 caliber, water-cooled by airspeed. When they fire, the brass casings spill across the floor like golden rain. The tail gunner, always the quiet one, kneels in a narrow coffin of glass at the back, facing backward into eternity. He's the sentinel. He sees the German fighters coming long before the others. He's the first to shout, "6 o'clock high!" The radio operator listens through static for coded orders. His compartment doubles as a hospital, a place where wounded men crawl to die in silence. And up front, the pilot and co-pilot wrestle with the controls, fighting the turbulence from flak bursts, nursing engines that run on bullet holes and faith. Each fortress is a system of trust, not heroics. No one man wins a mission. Everyone survives it together, or not at all. The gunners don't think in terms of glory. They think in angles, sectors, lead, range. Every call-out, every burst of fire is calculated. They don't even see the enemy as people anymore, just black specks that move through geometry and disappear in flame. On a typical mission, each gunner fires 1,200 to 1,500 rounds. Multiply that by 10 men. Multiply again by 300 bombers. That's nearly 5 million bullets cutting the air in one raid. It's not romantic. It's mechanical. But every bullet is a heartbeat. The sound of 10,000 workers back home machining brass and steel, turning human endurance into industrial thunder. Still, the math doesn't erase the fear. The gunners' diaries are full of it. Sergeant John Comer, waist gunner, wrote, "They came from the sun straight at us. I fired until the barrels went white. A 190 broke apart right in front of me. I could see the pilot's goggles before he vanished. Then I threw up in my mask." Sergeant Clarence Bud Anderson, tail gunner, described watching a bomber next to him take a direct hit. It folded like paper. One moment 10 men, the next nothing, just a cloud. And yet they kept flying. For gunners, victory wasn't shooting down the enemy. It was seeing the channel again. The sight of white cliffs through the frost-covered window meant you'd survived another mission, another 8 hours of cold terror. Ground crews would count the bullet holes, sometimes 200, sometimes 400. Mechanics patched them like surgeons. Crews marked each kill with painted swastikas under the cockpit. They didn't celebrate. They just cleaned the guns and loaded up for tomorrow, because the enemy always came back. The Luftwaffe adapted. Fighters began attacking from above and below the formation, using 30mm cannons and rockets. They fired through the blind spots, straight into the belly or from the 12 o'clock high, where gunners couldn't traverse fast enough. That's when the Americans added the chin turret. Controlled by the bombardier, it turned the fortress into a sphere of fire. The Luftwaffe's favorite attack angle vanished overnight. Now there was no safe direction. German pilots who'd once laughed at flying porcupines began writing in their diaries about nightmares, tracers chasing them in their sleep. Oberleutnant Hans Weick of JG-3 recalled, "The sky was filled with bullets. It was like flying into a wall. You could not outfly it. You could only hope it missed you." The wall of fire was not perfect, but it was relentless, and it changed everything. The gunners of the 8th Air Force weren't aces. They didn't duel or chase glory. They fought from cages of glass and steel, freezing, deafened, breathing bottled air, and they outlasted the best pilots in the world. When the Luftwaffe's losses began to mount, those men in the fortresses, young, shaking, half-blind from flak flashes, became the quiet instruments of a turning war. They weren't knights. They were workers. They weren't hunters. They were survivors. And survival, mission after mission, formation after formation, was the new definition of victory. By the end of 1944, one waist gunner described his job to a journalist in England with chilling simplicity: "I don't fly to fight, I fly so the next guy doesn't have to." The Flying Fortress had given ordinary men the power to burn an empire, one belt of 50 caliber rounds at a time. And the Germans, who once mocked that machine, were running out of pilots to face it. The gunners didn't know it then, but they were winning the air war, not by killing, but by refusing to die. October 14th, 1943. The air over Germany is clear, bright, and lethal. In the early morning frost at the airfields of East Anglia, 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses roar to life, engines coughing, wings trembling, vapor rising off the frozen grass. Ground crews wave them off silently. They all know the target: Schweinfurt, again. The first raid in August had crippled the city's ball-bearing factories, but German industry recovered faster than expected. Intelligence now says the plants are back online. If those bearings keep rolling, Germany's tanks, aircraft, and U-boats will keep fighting. The order is simple and final: return to Schweinfurt. Finish it. The pilots call it Black Thursday before it even begins. At 10:30 hours, the bomber stream forms over the North Sea, a silver river of engines stretching 50 miles long. But there's a problem. The P-47 Thunderbolts that normally escort them can only reach halfway. There will be no Mustang escorts. Once over central Germany, the fortresses are alone, and the Luftwaffe knows it. As the bombers cross the Rhine, German radar lights up. Sirens wail from Kassel to Nuremberg. Fighter bases scramble in sequence: JG-3, JG-26, JG-27, JG-300. Within minutes, 300 fighters are airborne. Bf-109s, FW-190s, twin-engine Zersturers with heavy cannons. It's the largest concentrated interception Germany has ever launched. At 25,000 feet, the fortresses level out. The sun is blinding. The sky is clear. And then, from the edge of the horizon, black dots appear. Dozens, then hundreds, descending like vultures. The first attack comes head-on. Luftwaffe pilots scream through the formations, guns blazing, closing from 800 to 200 yards in seconds. The air fills with flashes, 20mm shells tearing through nose sections, engines bursting into fire. Gunners return fire blindly, the vibration shaking their bones. Radio chatter dissolves into chaos. 2 o'clock high. Multiple bandits. Tails on fire. Bail out! Bail out! Bombers explode mid-air. Whole crews vanish in smoke. Waist gunners see their friends' planes break apart beside them, wings folding like paper. Yet the formation tightens. The rule is sacred. Never break formation, even in hell. One German ace, Heinrich Oehler, dives through the top formation, firing short bursts. He destroys 2 bombers in one pass, but his wingman never comes out of the dive. He's torn apart by crossfire before he can pull away. The second wave of German fighters comes from below. Rockets, Werfer Granite 21s, streak upward, exploding among the lower squadrons. The concussion lifts the bombers like leaves in a storm. Inside Miami Clipper, navigator Lieutenant James Fleming clings to his chart table as the floor shatters beneath him. The bombardier's glass nose is gone. His pilot is slumped over, dead. Fleming takes the controls himself, flying blind through smoke. Another B-17, My Prayer, loses both port engines. The pilot orders the crew to bail out, but the waist gunners refuse. They stay at their posts, firing until the ammo runs out. The bomber glides 200 miles before crash landing in a field. The Luftwaffe attacks for over 2 hours straight. At 13:30, the battered formation finally reaches Schweinfurt. Below them, the city's factories gleam in the autumn sun. The flak begins, thick, black, precise. Each burst rocks the planes like hammer blows. The bombardiers still work the Norden sights, steady as surgeons. Steady, steady, bombs away. The entire sky opens. Hundreds of bombs drop, falling through smoke and sunlight. They hit the Kugelfischer and Vereinigte factories directly, reducing them to twisted skeletons. German civilians run for cover as oil tanks detonate, the ground heaving like an earthquake. From the ground, it looks like the sun itself has fallen on Schweinfurt. Then the formation turns west, and the nightmare begins again. With fuel running low, gunners exhausted, and hundreds of fortresses damaged, the Luftwaffe renews the assault. Some German pilots are so close they can see the faces of the Americans through shattered plexiglass. A Bf-109 collides with a B-17 mid-turn. Both disintegrate. By the time the bombers reach the channel, the air smells of cordite and frozen blood. Of the 291 fortresses that took off that morning, 60 are gone. Another 138 are damaged beyond repair. 600 airmen killed, 65 captured. It is the bloodiest single day in the history of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Yet on the ground in Schweinfurt, the message is equally clear. Over half of Germany's ball-bearing output is destroyed. Production will never fully recover. In Berlin, Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring congratulates his fighter units. On paper, they've won. But the victory feels hollow. The Luftwaffe has lost 100 fighters and 40 experienced pilots. Men they cannot replace. Fuel consumption skyrocketed. Maintenance crews are exhausted. And the Americans somehow will be back. Within 3 days, new B-17s are already arriving in England. Within 3 weeks, the factories in Seattle have replaced every loss. The German propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, writes privately in his diary, "We can win 100 such victories and still lose this war." For the Americans, Black Thursday becomes both tragedy and proof. Proof that the fortress could go the distance. Proof that Germany could be hit and hit again. Proof that industrial will could outlast tactical perfection. One waist gunner, Sergeant John Luckadoo, later recalled, "When we landed, there were holes in every part of the ship. You could see daylight through the floor, but the engines were still running. That's when I stopped fearing the Germans. They could kill us, but they couldn't stop us." Black Thursday was supposed to break the 8th Air Force. Instead, it broke the Luftwaffe's illusion of control. After that day, German pilots stopped calling the B-17 the fat target. They started calling it Die Fliegende Mauer, the flying wall. And that wall was moving closer to Berlin every week. By early 1944, the air war over Europe had changed forever. The hunter had become the hunted. The Luftwaffe's legend, built on daring, precision, and aces, was now bleeding out in slow motion against a machine that didn't know how to die. The B-17 was never faster, sleeker, or more advanced than its enemies. But it was repeatable. That was its real weapon. The ability to turn one nation's factories, manpower, and willpower into a weapon that no individual pilot, however gifted, could destroy. When American aircrews called the B-17 the Flying Fortress, they weren't exaggerating. They were describing a machine that embodied industrial war in its purest form. Every one of its 13 guns, every rivet, every redundant system, was designed to endure. And endurance, not brilliance, was what won the war. The Luftwaffe's numbers tell the story better than any myth. In 1943, Germany still had roughly 3,000 operational fighters on the Western Front. By mid-1944, that number had fallen below 1,000. Of the 100,000 fighter pilots trained during the war, 85% would be dead by its end. Meanwhile, America was producing 700 B-17s per month, and every time Germany shot one down, the replacement was already en route. The German pilots knew it. You can hear the resignation in their combat reports. One FW-190 pilot from JG-2 interviewed after the war said, "We fought the bombers the way a man fights a flood. You shoot and it keeps coming. You don't stop it. You just drown in it." The flood didn't just drown the Luftwaffe in combat. It drowned its spirit. By 1944, most of the aces who once mocked the fortresses were gone. Egon Mayer, the genius of head-on attacks, killed in action. Walter Oesau, shot down in his FW-190. Adolf Galland, removed from command after failing to stop the American raids. The Luftwaffe's tactical brilliance couldn't save it from strategic starvation. There weren't enough pilots, enough fuel, enough bearings. Yes, the very bearings from Schweinfurt, to keep the war machine turning. The B-17 had attacked Germany's industrial bloodstream, and the patient never recovered. Each bomber formation wasn't just a mission. It was a moving verdict. Every bomb that fell on Regensburg, Bremen, or Berlin wasn't just destroying a factory. It was destroying the infrastructure that made war possible. By February 1944, during Big Week, the Luftwaffe's destruction became irreversible. The Americans didn't have to win every battle. They just had to keep flying them. After the war, Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland admitted the truth. When the Mustangs appeared and the fortresses came by day, we knew the end had begun. We no longer fought for victory, but for survival. The air war had turned into a meat grinder that no human skill could survive. A Luftwaffe Staffel that began with 40 planes might end the week with 12. The survivors were teenagers, boys with 20 flight hours, sent into the air with barely enough training to take off. The Americans, by contrast, were rotating crews, resting veterans, and feeding fresh squadrons into the sky daily. The Fortress wasn't just an aircraft. It was a doctrine, a network, a system designed to make death uneconomical for the enemy. By spring 1944, the bombers no longer needed to survive every mission, just long enough for the escorts to meet them halfway. And once the P-51 Mustangs joined them, the sky over Europe stopped belonging to Germany forever. From that point on, daylight over the Reich was American property. Factories went dark, oil plants burned, cities turned to rubble. The Luftwaffe's last hope, the Me-262 jet, came too late, with too little fuel, and too few pilots left alive to matter. Every German city that looked up in 1944 saw the same pattern. Hundreds of silver bombers, sunlight flashing on their wings, engines droning like an industrial heartbeat. Each one carried 4,000 pounds of explosives. Each one could fire 13 guns at once. Each one was a moving monument to the idea that quantity, coordination, and courage could break the spine of perfection. The Germans had mocked the Fortress for being slow. They called it clumsy, heavy, crude. They were right. And that was exactly why it worked. Because clumsy doesn't break, heavy doesn't scatter, crude doesn't stop. When a system is built to endure instead of excel, it becomes immortal in a way no fighter ace ever can be. The Luftwaffe's downfall wasn't just written in the flames of Schweinfurt or the wrecks of the Y-90s. It was written in the numbers. By mid-1944, Germany lost half its fighter strength every 30 days. American bomber production replaced its own losses every 10. By D-Day, Allied air superiority over France was 50-1. The Fortress had done what its name promised. It didn't outfly the Luftwaffe, it outlasted it. The German pilots had laughed at the flying box, but by the end, that box had eaten their Air Force alive. By 1945, the sky over Germany no longer belonged to men. It belonged to machines. The B-17 Flying Fortress had done what no one thought possible. It burned the Luftwaffe out of its own air, and then it kept flying. Every morning, the same ritual. Hundreds of engines roaring in the fog, the smell of fuel and oil, the slow rolling thunder as the bombers lifted off, one after another, like clockwork. They weren't squadrons anymore. They were an assembly line in motion. Each mission was a production cycle, factories feeding factories through destruction. When the fortresses crossed into Germany now, no fighters rose to meet them. Only the black puffs of flak and the red glow of cities below. Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, each name a synonym for fire. The Luftwaffe that once mocked these bombers no longer existed. Its aces were dead, its fuel gone, its planes scattered across bomb-cratered runways. The last Messerschmitts took off in desperation, piloted by boys barely trained to land. They didn't stand a chance. The fortress had outlasted them. Not because it was perfect, but because it didn't have to be. That's the paradox of total war. Perfection dies fast. Persistence lives forever. Each B-17 was part of something bigger. A nation that had turned production into power, steel into endurance, and endurance into strategy. When the German war machine collapsed, it wasn't crushed by genius. It was buried under repetition. By February 1945, the fortresses no longer targeted factories. They targeted capacity, the ability to make war itself. Oil refineries, train yards, bridges, cities. In Dresden, a single raid by B-17s and Lancasters turned a medieval city into a firestorm that burned oxygen from the air. Tens of thousands died in one night. It was the dark climax of a doctrine that began with precision bombing and ended with annihilation. The fortress had gone from defense to offense, from survival to supremacy. It started as the weapon of the desperate. It ended as the instrument of victory. One Luftwaffe survivor, years later, said it simply, "We thought we ruled the air. The Americans built a machine that ruled without us." The B-17's silhouette, wide wings, twin tails, 4 engines, became the shape of inevitability. Wherever it flew, empires fell silent. By May 1945, the last formations of the 8th Air Force flew over a dead Reich. Below, cities lay in ashes. Above, the contrails stretched across the horizon like chalk lines on the sky, the signature of victory written in vapor. The fortress had not just bombed Germany. It had rewritten how war was fought. It proved that courage multiplied by industry becomes unstoppable, that endurance, when mechanized, becomes destiny, and that in the age of the machine, the side that builds more will always outlast the side that fights better. The Luftwaffe's era of the ace was over. The era of systems had begun. But even as the smoke cleared over Europe, new shapes were taking flight, faster, sleeker, more terrifying. Jet engines, rockets, guided bombs. The fortress had ended one age of air warfare, but it had also birthed the next. Because the logic that won the skies over Germany, industrial repetition, mechanical dominance, and firepower without limit, was about to reach its final evolution. It began at 10:23 a.m., a pulse on a radar screen. Aboard the USS Lexington, a young radar operator named Ensign James Cox leaned into his headset, eyes fixed on the glowing arc. The contact was faint, distant, 120 miles northwest, but growing stronger by the second. "Multiple bogies inbound, bearing 270, Range 120 miles, altitude 20,000 feet. Within minutes, the entire Task Force 58 was on alert. On the carrier decks, flight crews sprinted through the heat, pulling chocks, loading ammunition, fueling tanks. The Pacific sun glared off the rows of parked aircraft, 220 F-6F Hellcats, wings folded like sleeping predators. Below deck, the Combat Information Center came alive. Voices, bearings, and numbers colliding in organized chaos. Admiral Mark Mitcher, calm as ice, gave the order that would define the battle. Launch everything we've got. Let's turn them back before they ever see the fleet. The hatch doors opened. One after another, the Hellcats roared down the deck, engines screaming, wings snapping open, tails lifting into the blue. Within minutes, the sky above the carriers turned into a spiral of ascending fighters. The climb rate of the F-6F, 12,000 feet per minute, made it seem like they were climbing into the sun itself. To the north, 450 Japanese aircraft were inbound, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes. The cream of Japan's remaining naval air power, launched from Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, the last of the Imperial Navy's great carriers. For the Japanese pilots, this was redemption. The humiliation of the marshals, the loss of Truk, the retreat from Rabaul, all of it led here. They had trained for months, rehearsing strikes against mock carrier formations. They believed that the old tactics would still work, that the samurai spirit, even outnumbered, could break the American machine. But they never saw what was waiting for them. Radar had already plotted their exact altitude, bearing, and closure rate. In the combat information centers aboard the U.S. carriers, controllers spoke into radios with mathematical calm. Hellcat Group Baker, Vector 310, Angels 20, bogies approaching, intercept in 5 minutes. Each vector was invisible precision, a digital ambush before digital even existed. The Hellcats reached 20,000 feet and spread out in pairs. Sunlight caught their navy blue fuselages as they leveled off into attack position. Below them, the Japanese formation glimmered, neat, tight, and utterly unaware. Lieutenant Alex Vrashu, a pilot from the USS Lexington, throttled forward. His radar intercept officer's voice came through the headset. "You're on top of them. 3 miles, no evasive." The first Hellcats dove. The 50 caliber guns thundered. 6 streams of tracers tore through the sky, and in seconds the formation below disintegrated. Within 15 minutes, the American fighters tore through the Japanese vanguard like saw blades through paper. Pilots reported multiple kills within seconds of contact. Vrashu alone destroyed 6 dive bombers in 8 minutes, 1 every 80 seconds. Below, carrier groups watched as burning planes fell like comets into the sea. The sailors began to cheer, even as the sky shimmered with black smoke trails and falling debris. It was not a battle. It was an equation. Radar vectoring plus altitude advantage, plus industrial-scale training equals annihilation. By sunset, 373 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The Americans lost 29. The pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name would stick forever. From that day, the Zero's legend from the myth of invincible agility was over. The hunter of 1942 had become prey by 1944. And the Hellcat, the Grumman Ironworks cat, had proven that in modern war, the machine that sees first wins first. The Japanese pilots never stood a chance. They were fighting radar, mathematics, and mass production. By nightfall, Task Force 58 had rewritten the rules of aerial combat and buried the last generation of Japan's elite aviators in the blue grave of the Philippine Sea. The age of the Zero was over. The age of systems had begun. For 2 years, the A6M-0 had been a ghost, fast, weightless, and untouchable. It was the first aircraft that made Allied pilots afraid to climb into the sky. In 1942, the Zero ruled everything from Ceylon to Hawaii. It shredded British Hurricanes over Burma, burned Dutch Buffaloes out of Java, and turned American Wildcats into wreckage over the Coral Sea. Its kill ratio, 12-1 in the opening months of the war, made it a symbol of Japanese invincibility. To Allied pilots, it seemed supernatural. It could climb vertically, turn inside any opponent, and dance on the edge of a stall. Its range, at over 1,900 miles, meant it could appear where no one expected it. The Americans nicknamed it the long arm of the Emperor, even when the Allies captured a crashed Zero in 1942, the famous Akutan Zero, and dissected it in California. Disbelief remained. Pilots still swore it defied physics. But every miracle hides a flaw. The Zero's secret wasn't magic. It was compromise, speed and agility purchased by stripping away everything else. No armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no bulletproof glass, no redundancy in controls. It was a flying sword, beautiful, fast, and fatally fragile. In 1942, that didn't matter. The Japanese pilots who flew them, men like Saburo Sakai, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, and Tetsuzo Iwamoto, were the best-trained aviators on Earth. They were veterans of China, masters of energy fighting, and products of a ruthless training system that washed out 90% of its candidates. Each one was an artist with a joystick. And against the inexperienced Americans of 1941 to 42, men trained in peacetime complacency, flying underpowered planes, the Zero was untouchable. It embodied the Bushido ideal: one warrior, one kill, one moment of perfection. The Zero wasn't designed for attrition, it was designed for purity, the aerial equivalent of a samurai duel. But war isn't a duel, it's a production line. By 1943, the cracks were showing. Japan's aircraft plants were being bombed. Its oil supply was shrinking. And most dangerously, its flight schools couldn't replace the dead. For every ace killed at Guadalcanal, there was no replacement. The Imperial Navy shortened training hours, cut tactics courses, and sent green pilots straight to the front. By the time of the Marianas Campaign, Japanese carrier air groups were filled with men who had 100 flight hours, barely enough to take off and land. Meanwhile, the Americans had turned air combat into a science. Every pilot was trained with gunnery simulators, dive recovery drills, and standardized tactics. Every carrier had a radar-directed combat information center, CIC, that could see hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. The Zero still turned tighter, but that didn't matter anymore. The new American fighters, the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair, were faster, stronger, and flown by men who didn't need to fight fair. They fought by vector, by information. In 1942, the Japanese pilot relied on instinct. In 1944, the American relied on mathematics. The myth of the Zero lingered long after its reality had burned away. Even Japanese pilots knew it. In one training manual written in late 1943, a senior instructor warned, "Do not expect the enemy to fight as he did in the Solomons. He now sees you before you see him." That sentence captured the turning point. The Americans had built an invisible weapon, radar, and trained an entire generation of pilots to use it. The Japanese still believed that spirit could overcome steel. The Americans built a system that didn't care about spirit. By 1944, the A6M50 could still roll, still climb, still fight. But every advantage it once had was gone. Its agility no longer mattered because it never got close enough to use it. The Bushido pilot still saw himself as a duelist. The Hellcat pilot saw himself as a node in a network, one signal among hundreds, moving in perfect synchronization. And in that difference, between instinct and integration, lay the death of the Zero's myth. When Japanese pilots took off from their carriers in June 1944, they believed they were fighting men. They were actually fighting math. War in the air is a contest between two kinds of genius: the pilot's skill and the engineer's system. In the Pacific, one side believed in the first. The other built the second. Bethpage, Long Island, 1943. Inside the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Plant, 12,000 workers swarm over aluminum skeletons. Men in oil-stained overalls rivet, weld, and assemble F-6F Hellcats on endless moving lines. The sound is deafening. Pneumatic drills, steel on steel, and the unbroken hum of a nation turning resources into dominance. Grumman's engineers called it the Iron Works. Every plane built here had a soul of steel and a heart of redundancy. The F-6F was designed not as a masterpiece, but as a tool, rugged, forgiving, modular. If a rookie could fly it, it could win the war. Every week, Long Island sent 100 Hellcats across the Atlantic to San Diego, then west to the Pacific. Each one had the same DNA, Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, 2,000 horsepower of mechanical fury, 650 caliber Browning M2s, 400 rounds per gun, self-sealing tanks, armored cockpit, and bulletproof glass canopy. A design philosophy summed up by Grumman's chief engineer Leroy Grumman. If a pilot can't bring it home with 2 holes, he'll bring it home with 4. Across the Pacific, Japan was fighting a different war. Kawanishi and Mitsubishi factories, 1943. Bombs had already fallen near Yokosuka. Materials were scarce. Factories worked by candlelight. The workforce was shrinking. Veterans replaced by teenage girls, apprentices, and conscripted students. Japan still produced aircraft, but not enough pilots to fly them. Before the war, Japanese naval aviators trained for 5 years before entering combat. By 1943, the program was cut to 9 months. By 1944, it was barely 4. The Imperial Navy still worshipped the Zero, its perfect turn rate, its feather-light frame, but perfection had become a liability. Each one required precision craftsmanship, hand-fitted rivets, and rare materials like duralumin and high-octane fuel Japan could no longer afford. The Hellcat, by contrast, was built for replication. It didn't need master craftsmen. It needed foremen. It didn't need devotion. It needed torque wrenches. By late 1943, the difference could be seen from orbit. America was producing 500 Hellcats a month. Japan, barely 80 Zeros. It wasn't just about quantity, it was about philosophy. Japan believed that war was an art, that a single pilot, properly trained, could offset any numerical disadvantage. The Americans believed that war was an equation, a process that could be learned, scaled, and perfected. The Hellcat was proof of that equation. It was built to be flown, fought, and fixed by ordinary men. A Japanese ace might need 2,000 hours of flight time to reach mastery. An American could become combat-ready in 300, and the Hellcat forgave the other 1,700 hours he didn't have. Grumman's test pilots described it as an airplane that wants to live. It could take hits from 20mm shells, lose a cylinder, lose hydraulics, lose an aileron, and still fly home. The Zero could not. When American intelligence examined the wrecks of Japanese aircraft, the difference was visceral. Where the Hellcat used thick armor plate, the Zero used paper-thin aluminum. Where the Hellcat's control cables were doubled, the Zeros were single-threaded. Every decision Japan made favored offense, assuming the pilot would never be hit. Every decision America made favored survival, assuming the pilot would. Behind those design philosophies were 2 economies, 2 cultures, and 2 futures. At the Naval Air Station in Pearl Harbor, Hellcat pilots trained using radar intercept drills, ground control vectoring, and simulated carrier defense scenarios. At Tsukuba Air Base, Japanese instructors lectured new recruits on the spirit of Yamato, courage, loyalty, and death before dishonor. The results were inevitable. When those 2 systems finally met over the Marianas, the Hellcat didn't just fight the Zero. It erased its logic. Radar told the Hellcat where to climb. Armor let it survive the first burst. Firepower let it end the fight in seconds. Every part of the system reinforced every other. By 1944, the war in the air was no longer a duel between men. It was a test between industrial processes. Japan was fighting with swords on a battlefield of algorithms. A pilot like Saburo Sakai, who had once shot down 30 planes in the Solomons, now found himself outnumbered 10 to 1, guided into ambushes he couldn't see, and flying an aircraft that couldn't dive fast enough to escape. He called it like being hunted by ghosts. Those ghosts had names: Hellcat, Corsair, Radar, CIC, and Industry. In the Pacific, production lines had become predators. Every warplane tells its own truth in numbers. And the F-6F Hellcat's truth wasn't beauty or elegance, it was math, ruthless, repeatable math. By 1944, the U.S. Navy's fleet fighter wasn't the fastest plane in the Pacific. It wasn't the most maneuverable. It wasn't even the most feared at first. But the Hellcat was designed around a single formula: power x protection x predictability equals survival. Each piece of data was a bullet point in that formula. Engine: Pratt & Whitney R2800-10W double wasp. A 2,000 horsepower, 18-cylinder beast that could climb 12,000 feet per minute, punch through tropical storms, and take a direct hit from shrapnel without losing a cylinder. It burned through 200 gallons per hour and didn't care. Speed: 380 mph in level flight, 420 in a dive. The Zero could barely reach 340. That meant a Hellcat pilot could choose when to fight, when to flee, and when to dictate the vertical, the single most decisive advantage in aerial combat. Armor: 212 pounds of cockpit plating plus bulletproof glass and self-sealing tanks. The Zero carried none of that. It traded protection for agility, a fatal mistake in a war of attrition. Firepower: 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, synchronized for convergence at 250 yards. Each gun fired 850 rounds per minute. That's 8,000 rounds of 50 caliber per Hellcat per minute, each round capable of punching through a Zero's engine block. Multiply that by a combat air patrol of 40 Hellcats, over 300,000 bullets in 60 seconds. The Japanese called them steel storms. Range: 1,090 miles with drop tanks. That gave the Navy's fighters endurance equal to or greater than Japan's long-legged Zeros. The old myth that the Zero could outlast its enemies evaporated. But the true killer stat wasn't hardware. It was coordination. Radar detection range by 1944: 140 miles. Fleet combat information centers could track, classify, and vector Hellcat squadrons to intercept positions using radio commands in real time. Each CIC tracked bearing, altitude, and closure speed, guiding pilots to ambush the enemy before they were even visible. It was the death of chance. In 1942, Japan fought wars of instinct. In 1944, the U.S. Navy fought wars of prediction. Every Hellcat launch was a pre-calculated kill zone. Aboard the carriers, radar plots looked like chessboards, each contact labeled, tracked, and assigned an intercept pair. Pilots didn't hunt blindly. They arrived in the right place at the right time, every time. When American statisticians analyzed results from the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the numbers broke belief. 373 Japanese planes destroyed in one day. Hellcats lost in air combat, 29. That's a 12.8 to 1 kill ratio. And that's the average. Across the entire Pacific War, the ratio would rise to 19:1. For every Hellcat lost, 19 Japanese aircraft fell. But the deeper number, the one that truly broke the Imperial Navy, was pilot survival. The average Japanese naval aviator in 1944 had a 1 in 4 chance of surviving a single mission. The average American Hellcat pilot had an 85% chance of surviving the entire war. That's not luck. That's logistics turned into armor. Grumman built 12,275 Hellcats in just 2 years, a number so staggering that the Navy sometimes ran out of space to store them. Each one was a product of lessons learned in blood. The weaknesses of the F-4F Wildcat, the horrors of Guadalcanal, the fragility of early radar, all corrected, all refined. Meanwhile, Japan's aircraft numbers fell off a cliff. 1942, 8,000 aircraft built. 1944, barely 4,000. Pilot production dropped by 60%. You can't fight air wars with equations like that. The Zero's formula, lightness plus pilot skill, had been overtaken by time. Even Japan's new fighters, the A6N5C and N1K2J Shiden, couldn't fix the fundamentals. They were brilliant aircraft flown by men who had never seen combat before. The Hellcat didn't just kill aircraft. It killed systems, radar, industry, and doctrine included. In the summer of 1944, Japanese pilots described the sky as a sea of invisible traps. Radar-guided interceptions left them disoriented and outnumbered before they could even see their enemies. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, the U.S. Navy's top ace, said it best. "They came into range already defeated. We just gave physics the final push." Physics and mass production. The Zero had been born in secrecy, nurtured by artisans. The Hellcat was born in daylight, stamped by machines and delivered in bulk. The difference was the future itself. The numbers weren't glamorous, they weren't romantic, but they didn't need to be, because numbers end illusions. And by 1944, the illusion of Japanese air supremacy had burned out under the relentless arithmetic of the Hellcat. The Hellcat's first trial by fire came not in the grand battles of the Philippine Sea, but over two small, blood-soaked specks of coral, Tarawa and Makin Atoll, November 1943. Until then, the F-6F was still a rumor. The Zero still haunted American memory, the sleek, silent killer from Pearl Harbor and the Solomons. Few U.S. pilots had even seen a Hellcat in combat, and none yet knew if it could survive against Japan's most seasoned veterans. That changed on November 20th, 1943. As the U.S. Marines stormed Tarawa's lagoon, waves of Japanese aircraft took off from nearby bases in the Marshalls, intent on smashing the invasion fleet. Aboard the carriers USS Essex, USS Bunker Hill, and USS Yorktown, the first operational Hellcat squadrons, VF-9, VF-16, and VF-5, waited. Radar picked up the incoming formations before any man could see them. Controllers aboard the carriers vectored their fighters into intercept positions with cold precision. Bandits approaching, bearing 215, Angels 15, range 70 miles. The Hellcats launched in pairs, climbing through a blazing sunrise. In their cockpits were pilots like Lieutenant Seamander Edward Butch O'Hare, already a Medal of Honor recipient, and Lieutenant Seamander David McCampbell, still months away from becoming the Navy's top ace. Most of them had never fired their guns in anger. They were about to rewrite the Pacific's playbook. At 20,000 feet, the Hellcats leveled off, big, square-shouldered beasts of steel and horsepower. Below, the enemy formation shimmered, A6M Zeros and D3A Val dive bombers, escorted by veteran pilots from Rabaul. But this time, it wasn't a fair fight. The Americans saw the enemy first. Radar had given them the high ground before the battle even began. McCampbell's wingman called the first contact. "Bandits, 10 o'clock low." The Hellcats rolled, inverted, and dove. 650 caliber Brownings tore the Dawn apart. Zeros disintegrated mid-turn, their fuel tanks erupting into fireballs. Dive bombers tumbled like broken glass. The Japanese formation collapsed in minutes. When the smoke cleared, 28 enemy aircraft lay burning or sinking, for the loss of 2 Hellcats. 2. The report stunned both navies. U.S. intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor initially refused to believe the kill ratio. They ordered multiple cross-checks with gun camera footage. The footage didn't lie. The Hellcat had passed its baptism, and it had done so not through luck or spirit, but through information. Radar had given the Americans the element of surprise. The plane's brute speed and firepower had done the rest. Japanese survivors of that battle later wrote of their shock. One pilot, Ensign Matsuo Sato, described being attacked from above, from behind, from nowhere. He never saw a single American face. He called it fighting ghosts made of thunder. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, The U.S. Navy had an aircraft that could take the initiative, that could dictate when and how combat occurred. At Tarawa and Macon, that shift was invisible to the men on the beaches, but decisive to the men in the sky. On the ground, Marines fought over 50 yards of sand for 76 hours. Above them, the Hellcats turned the battle's entire outcome. No Japanese reinforcements ever made it through. Every bomber that tried was shot down before reaching the fleet. That was the quiet miracle of the Hellcat. It made survival seem routine. In 1942, Japanese aircraft dictated the rhythm of the Pacific. In 1943, the U.S. Navy flipped the tempo. The Tarawa operation proved that the Hellcats' numbers weren't theoretical. They were lethal. When the carrier groups regrouped afterward, pilots walked the decks in disbelief. The air officers compared logs, tallying kills. The arithmetic looked unreal. 28 enemy aircraft destroyed, 2 Hellcats gone. A 14.1 kill ratio on the first major combat debut. It wasn't a fluke. It was the system working exactly as designed. From that moment, the U.S. Navy trusted the Hellcat completely. Squadrons equipped across the Pacific. Factories doubled production. Training programs standardized every gunnery pattern. Every roll, every radar intercept drill. The Hellcat became a language all pilots could speak. And the Japanese, when still clinging to instinct and improvisation, were now flying in the dark. By the end of 1943, the Imperial Navy had lost nearly 700 aircraft in the Marshalls alone. By the start of 1944, its elite air groups were gone, replaced by hastily trained recruits. The air war had changed forever, and Tarawa was its first proof of concept. Radar had turned surprise into geometry. The Hellcat had turned geometry into destruction. When Japanese survivors were debriefed, one officer wrote bitterly, "They were waiting for us, always waiting. They were not men. They were a machine." He was right. The machine had just switched on. By the dawn of 1944, the Pacific had turned into something entirely new. A sky that could see. For the first time in human history, battle wasn't decided by eyesight, but by electrons. The U.S. Navy's Radar-Directed Combat Air Patrols, SEAP, had fused technology, tactics, and timing into a single lethal equation. The system was elegant, invisible, and absolute. Each carrier in Task Force 58 was its own command center, the heart of a massive neural network stretching hundreds of miles. The Combat Information Center, CIC, buried deep within the ship, was a dark room full of glowing scopes, headsets, and steady voices. Every blip on the screen was a story. Altitude, heading, closure rate, number of bogies. That information didn't sit still. It flowed, outward, upward, and into the air. Destroyer pickets stationed ahead of the carrier line extended the network's reach, their radar antennas spinning through salt haze and heat. They were the tripwires of the Pacific. The instant their screens pulsed, the CIC aboard the carriers had data. Within 60 seconds, the entire fleet did, and that's when the math began. Each contact's course and speed fed into a simple equation. Vector, V, equals, target bearing, plus, closure rate, x time. Controllers turned that into human words over the radio. Hellcat read 3, bogies 300, Angels 20, range 70, turn to 085. It sounded calm, routine, but every syllable was calculated to the second. The result was control, total, invisible control. For the first time, American pilots didn't hunt. They were guided, like arrows fired from a machine. The Japanese never had a chance. Their tactics still depended on visual scouting and radio silence. Their planes lacked reliable long-range radios. Their formation leaders flew until they saw the enemy, which meant by the time they did, the Hellcats were already diving from above. At Kwajalein, the system proved itself beyond theory. January 1944. The Japanese launched 70 aircraft from Roy and Namur to strike the American invasion fleet. Radar picked them up 110 miles out. Controllers calmly vectored 36 Hellcats from VF-10 and VF-9 into intercept. In less than 20 minutes, the Hellcats destroyed 56 enemy aircraft. The fleet never even saw a bomb fall. Rear Admiral Arthur Radford, who oversaw fleet air defense, summed it up bluntly. They never reached us. They never even found us. This was the collapse. The quiet, calculated destruction of the Japanese air arm not through combat, but through displacement. Japan's pilots were still brave, their planes still agile. But they were fighting the wrong kind of war. They were fighting inside a system designed to erase reaction time. The numbers tell the story better than words. In 1942, Japanese raids reached their targets 80% of the time. By mid-1944, fewer than 15% ever did. Of those, less than half dropped bombs before being shot down. That's not just attrition. That's extermination by information. And as the system matured, it got even deadlier. By March 1944, every carrier group in Task Force 58 had radar coordination not just between ships, but between squadrons. If one cap element was low on fuel or ammo, another was already in the air, rotated in before the gap appeared. Hellcats didn't fly blind patrols anymore. They flew in response to real-time data, 360 degrees of coverage, day and night. The Japanese called it the net of the gods. They thought the Americans had discovered some supernatural trick. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. America had learned to mechanize awareness. The Hellcat was its blade. When pilots from Air Group 15 aboard USS Essex tallied their results over the Marianas, the math broke aviation history. 689 enemy aircraft destroyed in 3 months. Losses, 24 Hellcats. That's a 28-to-1 ratio, the highest of the entire war. The Japanese still believed courage could offset imbalance. They called their new recruits Heaven's Eagles. Most had fewer than 100 flight hours. Many couldn't land on a carrier. They were thrown into the sky anyway. Radar saw them. The CIC plotted them. The Hellcats climbed to meet them. And in the empty blue above Saipan and Tinian, the equation played out again and again. Detection plus altitude plus firepower is death. By the time Japanese pilots saw their enemies, it was already over. One Hellcat ace, Lieutenant Alex Vrachu, described it perfectly after shooting down 6 dive bombers in 8 minutes. They were still flying in formation when I opened fire. Not one broke away. They were disciplined. They were doomed. It wasn't arrogance, it was automation. The system worked too well. The Americans had found a way to turn vision into prediction, and prediction had become prophecy. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would only prove what was already obvious. The Zero was obsolete, and Japan's skies belonged to the machine. The war that began with men watching horizons had evolved into one fought by invisible circles on radar screens. The Hellcat didn't just fly through those circles, it completed them. June 19, 1944. The morning air over the Philippine Sea was calm, blue, endless, and deceptively gentle. But below that sky, the last great carrier duel of the Pacific was about to begin. At dawn, Japan's first mobile fleet steamed eastward. 9 carriers, 430 aircraft, and the last of Japan's trained naval aviators. They called it Operation A-Go, the plan to annihilate the U.S. invasion force striking Saipan. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa believed his fleet still held the soul of the Imperial Navy. His air groups had been rebuilt after Truk, filled with fresh pilots who'd sworn to die before retreating. They had practiced endlessly for this moment, the decisive battle to turn the tide. Ozawa didn't know he was flying into a trap 200 miles wide. Task Force 58, 5 carrier groups under Admiral Mark Mitscher, had been waiting for this. The Americans didn't need to guess where the enemy was coming from. Radar told them. At 0934 hours, the radar operators aboard USS Lexington picked up the first wave of Japanese aircraft. Large group of bogies, bearing 320 degrees, range 150 miles, altitude 20,000 feet. Combat information centers across the task force came alive. Controllers triangulated bearings, plotted vectors, and radioed squadrons on standby. In less than 10 minutes, 220 F-6F Hellcats were airborne. They climbed in pairs, spiraling upward into the sun. The Japanese came in 4 waves, 373 planes in total. Fighters, torpedo bombers, and dive bombers, the last major carrier strike Japan would ever launch. The Americans intercepted the first wave 70 miles from the fleet. The battle didn't unfold like a dogfight. It unfolded like math. Each radar contact became a calculated intercept point. Each intercept became a firing solution. Each firing solution became a kill. Hellcat pilot Lieutenant Alex Vrashew, flying from the USS Lexington, spotted a formation of D-4Y Judy dive bombers lining up for their run. He throttled forward and dove. 6 planes fell in 8 minutes. His gun camera film, still studied today, shows tracers walking up wings, engines detonating, planes bursting into fireballs. Vrashew never even broke a sweat. Another pilot, Ensign Robert Irol, described the scene simply. They came in straight and never fired. They didn't even see us. By the time the first wave reached the fleet, it was already annihilated. The few that broke through found a sky filled with flak and another wall of Hellcats diving from above. The USS South Dakota took 1 hit, the only American ship to be damaged that day. By noon, the sea was burning. Dozens of Japanese aircraft lay scattered across the waves, smoking wrecks bobbing like tombstones. The second and third waves met the same fate. Every time the radar pulsed, new vectors went out. Every time the vectors went out, the Hellcats found their prey. In some squadrons, pilots ran out of ammunition and began ramming their targets or watching helplessly as the last Zeros dove straight into the ocean, their pilots refusing to bail out. Admiral Ozawa's flight leaders reported back in disbelief. Enemy fighters at every altitude. No openings, no escape. By sunset, the battle was effectively over. The results were staggering. Out of 373 Japanese aircraft launched that day, only 35 returned. The Americans lost 29 planes, most to fuel exhaustion, not enemy fire. One naval intelligence officer summarized the outcome in a single line. The Japanese Navy committed suicide over the Marianas. That night, aboard the USS Lexington, pilots gathered on the flight deck, exhausted and exhilarated. They joked about the battle's absurd ease. Someone called it a turkey shoot. The name stuck forever. But behind the humor was something colder. Realization. The Imperial Navy's air arm, once the terror of the Pacific, was gone. The kill ratio that day was 12.8 to 1. Over the entire Marianas campaign, it would rise to 19 to 1. The Japanese had entered the battle with the same faith that carried them since Pearl Harbor, that courage, training, and sacrifice could overcome odds. They left it without an air force. The truth was merciless. The Zero still turned tighter. The Japanese still flew bravely. But the Hellcat didn't fight duels anymore. It fought data wars. Radar had replaced eyesight. Altitude had replaced instinct. Coordination had replaced courage. And the Zero, that legendary machine of the early war, was now a statistic. After the battle, Admiral Chester Nimitz sent a simple message to Washington. A decisive defeat for the enemy. Our losses light. Their losses catastrophic. He was being modest. In 6 hours, the United States had erased the Imperial Navy's air power from the Pacific. The sea below shimmered with oil and flame. The sky above belonged to the machine. The Great Marianas turkey shoot wasn't a battle. It was an autopsy. The cause of death, believing that skill could outlast systems. October 1944. The Imperial Japanese Navy was out of time. Its carriers had no air wings, its pilots no experience, and its fuel tanks almost empty. Yet Tokyo ordered one last gamble, a desperate attempt to strike the American invasion fleet off Leyte Gulf. The operation was called Show 1, Victory Operation. To the men flying into it, it would become a funeral. At dawn on October 12th, the sky over Formosa filled with Japanese aircraft. Fighters, bombers, torpedo planes, everything that could still fly. They came from the home islands, from Okinawa, from Formosa's last functioning airfields. On paper, it was an air fleet of nearly 700 aircraft. In reality, it was a graveyard with wings. Below them, Task Force 38, Mitcher's new fast carriers. Spread across 600 miles of sea, their radar nets, perfected since the Marianas, now stretched farther than ever. Destroyers, cruisers, and escort carriers formed a radar wall so deep that not a single enemy plane could approach unseen. At 0700 hours, the first blips appeared, 180 miles out, bearing north-northwest. CIC controllers aboard the USS Essex and USS Intrepid immediately vectored 3 cap groups to intercept. They never saw the enemy with their eyes. The intercept was purely mathematical. 30 Hellcats climbed to 20,000 feet, throttles wide open. Within minutes, they met the first Japanese formation head-on. Val dive bombers escorted by A-6 M50s. The battle lasted 12 minutes. 36 Japanese planes shot down. 0 American losses. It went on like that for days. Every dawn, radar picked up new contacts. Every contact became a vector. Every vector became a kill. By nightfall, the seas around Formosa were littered with burning wreckage. Japanese pilots who survived described it as being hunted by invisible hawks. One, Lieutenant Satoru Ono, wrote in his diary before disappearing in combat, "They know we are coming before we leave the ground. It is as if the air itself betrays us." By the end of October 15th, the Japanese had lost over 500 aircraft. Virtually the entire air strength intended to defend the Philippines. Admiral Toyoda Suemu, commanding from Tokyo, wept when the reports arrived. His victory operation had erased the last generation of Japan's trained pilots. The Americans called it simply the Battle of Formosa. It wasn't even recognized as a separate campaign. The loss ratio was too one-sided to qualify as a battle. Then came Leyte Gulf. October 24th, 1944, the largest naval battle in history. Over 200,000 men, 280 warships, and 4 Japanese carrier groups fighting for the soul of the Pacific. But this time, Japan's carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, Chiyoda, were decoys. Their decks were nearly empty, their hangars hollow. Only 108 aircraft remained across all 4. When they launched them that morning, most were shot down within an hour. Radar-directed Hellcats from USS Essex, Intrepid, and Enterprise swept the sky clean. The Japanese commanders knew it. The carriers weren't weapons anymore. They were bait. Sacrifices meant to lure the American fleet north so that Japan's remaining battleships could strike the invasion force from the south. It didn't work. Radar ruined the timing. American fleets tracked both Japanese forces simultaneously. The ambush failed before it began. In one day, the U.S. Navy sank or crippled every Japanese carrier still afloat. Zuikaku, the last survivor of Pearl Harbor, went down with her flag still flying. Above the sinking ships, Hellcats circled like metal vultures, cutting down lifeboats, strafing retreating aircraft, and hunting the last desperate torpedo planes trying to make their runs. The kill ratios reached 50-1 in some engagements. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, flying from the Essex, shot down 9 planes in a single mission, the highest one-day total in U.S. Navy history. When his guns finally jammed, he radioed, half laughing, "I'm out of ammo. Send up more targets." By the end of Leyte Gulf, Japan's naval air arm had ceased to exist. Admiral Ozawa's post-battle report listed his carrier force as operationally extinct. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff searched for answers and found only ashes. There would be no new air groups, no new pilots, no new machines. And so the Japanese turned to the unthinkable, the kamikaze. The first suicide strikes began at Leyte. Dozens of inexperienced pilots, flying outdated aircraft filled with fuel and explosives, deliberately crashed into American ships. The attacks shocked the U.S. Navy, not for their damage, but for their desperation. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japan had abandoned even the illusion of tactical control. The Zero, once a symbol of dominance, had become a guided bomb. The Hellcat had done more than win air superiority. It had forced Japan to change the definition of war. From now on, it wouldn't be about who could outfly the enemy, but who could die first. Radar had stripped away the human element of surprise. The machine age had stripped away everything else. By the end of 1944, the Pacific skies were a one-sided equation. Hellcats in the air, radars on the sea, and ghosts on the other side of the horizon. The Imperial Navy was dead. It just hadn't hit the water yet. By early 1945, the Pacific was no longer a battlefield. It was a laboratory. The United States had perfected something Japan never could, a war run by mathematics, not mythology. The F-6F Hellcat stood at the center of that transformation. It wasn't the fastest plane, it wasn't the prettiest, it wasn't even the deadliest in a single engagement, but it was the most systemic, the physical embodiment of an industrial process that could see, think, and kill faster than any individual pilot. The Japanese called their pilots samurai of the sky. The Americans built a system that didn't need samurai. Every piece of it, radar, radio, training, tactics, production, was a gear in the same machine. The result was not just victory, it was inevitability. The kill ratio tells the story brutally and clearly. 19-1. For every Hellcat shot down in air combat, 19 Japanese planes fell. By war's end, 5,163 enemy aircraft had been destroyed by Hellcat pilots. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who survived 200 missions, said after the war, "They were not fighting as men, they were fighting as a system." He wasn't wrong. At the start of 1942, Japan ruled the skies through pilot mastery. Men who had trained for years, fought by instinct, and relied on agility and aggression. The Zero's design reflected that worldview. Light, fast, fragile. Perfect for duels, but not for endurance. The Hellcat was the opposite. Its design assumed mistakes. Its systems assumed losses. It turned survivability into doctrine. That's why, even after being hit, a Hellcat could bring its pilot home. A burned, shot-up, oil-leaking engine still able to land on a carrier deck. Japanese planes, by contrast, burned on impact. Their pilots had no second chance. In 1942, the Imperial Navy had 4,000 experienced aviators. By 1945, fewer than 200 remained alive. The rest were dead, missing, or flying kamikaze missions. Every Zero destroyed was more than a plane lost. It was a man Japan couldn't replace. The United States built its pilots like it built its planes, in assembly lines. Every Hellcat pilot learned the same patterns, the same gunnery corrections, the same radio discipline. There was no ace culture. There was procedure, and procedure doesn't panic. When radar calls came in, no one asked where. They already knew. They trusted the system. Japan trusted courage. America trusted coordination. The outcome was decided before the dogfights even began. Even the numbers in production were obscene in their imbalance. 6,477 Hellcats built in 2 years. 3,200 Zeros built in the same period, many flown by trainees. U.S. pilot output, 8,000 per year. Japan, fewer than 1,200. This wasn't a clash of machines. It was a collision between timelines. Japan had built an air force for 1939, when craftsmanship and heroism still mattered. America built one for 1944, when logistics had replaced luck. The myth of the invincible Zero was dead. The myth of the individual warrior died with it. The Hellcat's real victory wasn't over aircraft, it was over philosophy. When the Japanese sent their first kamikazes at Leyte, they weren't trying to win. They were trying to make dying matter again. It was a spiritual reaction to a mechanical enemy, the last gasp of Bushido in a world that had turned digital in spirit, if not yet in form. And yet even that failed. Because radar didn't care. The Hellcat didn't hesitate. The system didn't flinch. From the Marianas to Okinawa, every engagement ended the same way. Radar contact, vector call, intercept, kill. The air war had become procedural, predictable, perfectly cold. When Japanese officers studied post-war American records, they were stunned by the data. Every cap launch, every enemy contact, every fuel reading, logged, analyzed, iterated. War had become an algorithm. And the F-6F Hellcat was its first hardware. Even Germany's Luftwaffe would later study the Pacific data and conclude, the United States has proven that the modern fighter is not the pilot's weapon, but the fleet's weapon. That was the future of air combat. The Hellcat didn't just kill the Zero. It killed the concept of individual mastery. It proved that in the age of machines, no hero can stand against a network. Japan entered the Pacific War believing that courage could defy odds. America ended it, proving that odds, properly engineered, erase courage. And so, as 1945 dawned, the sky above the Pacific was no longer the realm of knights and aces. It belonged to operators, controllers, and production engineers, men who fought with bearings, equations, and radar scopes. The sword had finally met the assembly line, and the sword broke first. By 1945, the air above the Pacific was silent except for one sound, the deep, rhythmic hum of Hellcats returning home. The Zero was gone, the sky empty. Japan's last squadrons had burned out over Okinawa, their aircraft reduced to kamikaze shells and wreckage drifting in salt spray. The Hellcat hadn't just survived, it had outlasted everything. From its first kills over Tarawa to its last missions over Tokyo Bay, the F-6F proved that endurance beats elegance, and information beats instinct. The final tally told the whole story. 19 kills for every loss. The greatest kill ratio in aviation history. But by the time the last carrier landed its planes, the world that built the Hellcat was already ending. In hangars across the US and Japan, engineers were sketching something new, machines without propellers, without mercy, powered by flame instead of pistons. The jet age had begun. The same logic that made the Hellcat unstoppable, radar guidance, predictive control, and production by the thousands, would now leap forward into a new dimension. The F-6F had been the last great piston warrior, the king of the analog sky. What came next would make even its 19-1 record look primitive. The P-80 Shooting Star, Me-262, and Gloucester Meteor were already flying. Straight wings, screaming turbines, speed near 600 miles an hour. In that new sky, no amount of armor or radio control could save the slow. The world was entering a race against its own technology, and the finish line would not be peace. Still, for one brief, impossible moment, the Hellcat stood as the purest form of victory. It was a machine built not for perfection, but for persistence. And persistence had reshaped history. It broke an empire. It rewrote the logic of air combat. It turned the romanticism of the ace into a spreadsheet of results. The pilots who flew it didn't see themselves as legends. They saw themselves as parts of something larger, a flying network, a machine made of men and steel. That was its true power. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Hellcats flew over Tokyo Bay as the peace documents were signed aboard the USS Missouri. Below them, the same radar that once guided them to battle now guided ships into harbor. The machine had won. In a war that began with intuition and ended with algorithms, the F-6F Hellcat was the bridge from the age of heroes to the age of systems. Because in modern war, the deadliest weapon isn't courage or craftsmanship, it's coordination. And the Hellcat was coordination with wings, The Japanese pilots who once mocked American machines never understood what they were really fighting. They weren't fighting aircraft. They were fighting process. And process doesn't die.